So at the heart of our examination of the South China Sea and the tensions and attention racking it is, I think, a fundamental question. Can our international system keep up with what is a rapidly evolving geopolitical and economic environment, more complex than what could have been imagined when that system was first built? The stakes are tremendously high, and not only are security interests at risk, but as Mr. Bitzinger noted, there are tremendous economic equities at stake. There is not only millions of people's livelihoods depending on the free access to the resources in the South China Sea, but also half of the world's global shipping worth something like $5 trillion US. While certainly not perfect and not able to stop all violence, our international system has done much to prevent major wars and deter coercion since World War II. And one of the primary ways that it has done this is by helping resolve power differentials between states. And indeed, when two states are vying for the same resources, status, or objectives, those power differentials can be highly tempting venues for coercion. And when the differentials are especially great, those venues of coercion are especially tempting. Today, power is a complex and multifaceted concept defined not only by the might of one's military, but also by the size of one's economy and the strength of one's demography. And for the most part, our system has evolved alongside those changing phases of power. Global interdependence, economic integration, and transnational courts, multilateral protocols, and yes, punitive actions have created an interlocking lattice that allows the international community to carry a sort of vigilance against more overt forms of coercion. This system has promoted a relatively robust set of norms that, even in the context of an anarchic international system, we've started to talk about it as a rules-based order. Yet many of the same weaknesses in that order do keep cropping back up. Weak spots like when disputes are riven by especially stark power differentials. And of course, when political will to maintain and support our system is hard to come by. And unfortunately, these weaknesses are especially present in the South China Sea. If wide power differentials exacerbate the threat of coercion, then the South China Sea is indeed ripe for it. The region's claimant states vary broadly in the size not only of their militaries, but also those sources of soft power that I mentioned in the modern world, economics, demography, and others. This vital global waterway is bordered by the world's second largest economy, as well as its 134th. One South China Sea claimant sports a blue water navy and an aircraft carrier, and soon several aircraft carriers, while other claimants in the region depend on foreign countries for their patrol boats. But perhaps most significantly, China's population is twice as large as all of Southeast Asia combined. But as the modern global environment becomes more interconnected and complex, the tools with which we apply influence and also coercion are also becoming more sophisticated and numerous. Coercion is innovating, and our international system in this area, I think, is largely standing still. Most telling is the pernicious and growing threat of gray zone coercion, or the kinds of gray behaviors that are attempts at bullying or retribution that fall just below that nebulous threshold that would traditionally trigger international outcry or condemnation or action in what we would hope to be an otherwise well-functioning international system. Because our increasingly interconnected world is becoming more complex and more interdependent, this kind of behavior can manifest itself in many ways, often repurposing supposedly safe and non-hostile tools, frequently economic tools, as means of aggression. One of the most notable examples of this is, of course, the Chinese Coast Guard. Recent years have seen many instances of these ships ramming and harassing small and civilian vessels of multiple countries around the South China Sea. Their supposed white hulls, traditionally denoting them as law enforcement rather than naval vessels, are mere fig leaves when they are being used to apply force in the name of Chinese strategic objectives. But these are new forms of coercion floating around the South China Sea that are including not just irritable Coast Guard ships, but those tools of economic warfare that I was talking about. They're becoming more sophisticated and they're becoming more frequently deployed. We saw this with the shutdown of rare earth mineral shipments to Japan and brazen incursions into Vietnam-claimed waters by Chinese offshore oil rigs, themselves accompanied by dozens of supposedly civilian vessels aggressively defending those rigs as they entered Vietnamese-claimed waters. China has muscled other countries out of traditional fisheries and even reportedly exercised small but pointed acts of pettiness, like stalling shipments at border crossings of produce just long enough for that produce to spoil. Of course, to make matters worse, as these new venues of coercion are evolving, the traditional sources of power used to deter such coercion are being undermined. The conspicuous proliferation of precision munitions and other means of so-called anti-access area denial weapons may threaten traditional means of American power projection, or perhaps just as dangerously, create the perception that these means of projection are threatened. If countries throughout the region, including traditional US allies and partners, begin to worry that the US would blink in the face of a confrontation with a major power, then the regional order the US seeks to buttress could truly begin cracking. But beyond the credibility of US security guarantees, the massive dredging and island-building operations seen in the South China Sea threaten to undermine the credibility of the international system writ large, as it fails to meaningfully push back. Though this summer's arbitral tribunal ruling has constrained how much those artificial islands could plausibly be used to legally support expansive territorial claims, they suggest further that China has the ability to change the facts on the ground without that significant pushback from the international community. And moreover, and perhaps more dangerously, these islands also feed the narrative that China's strategic reach is growing, and that they will be able to militarize with anti-access area denial weapons capable of closing off large areas from US influence, much less the influence of other countries. Indeed, these new and dueling narratives also demonstrate how information warfare is emerging as yet another new form of modern state power. In absolute, objective terms, the United States is likely to remain well ahead in its long-term competition with China. Even if the size of China's total economy soon exceeds that of the United States, Beijing faces grave distributional and demographic issues that won't be resolved with impressive GDP numbers. Militarily, China certainly will soon brandish significant regional capabilities, but is far from the global projection ability the United States possesses. And yet, this nagging concern of American decline, or the concern that American politics will turn inward, could be powerful enough to realize some of the same effects as though that decline were in fact real. China has arguably capitalized on this nagging concern, picking apart informal coalitions of countries that would otherwise have supported the arbitration ruling and stringing together new ventures with its One Belt, One Road investment initiatives. A solution to these power imbalances and the new modern forms of coercion springing up from them will need to recognize what has not worked. Future security architectures will need to be flexible and adaptable as new security challenges present themselves. And indeed, the region has benefited from numerous interlocking, overlapping, and distributed relationships and institutions, historically shying away from rigid alliance systems. The key will be making those institutions and relationships credible and effective so that they can be a flexible but potent network of security. A network that would operate in conjunction with the United States when it needed to, but seek to exist independently and eventually self-sufficiently. Though scholars and analysts have written about the political promise of networked security, they do still need to be anchored in a minimum credible defense capability. In the Asia-Pacific, this will likely need to be done in close collaboration with more high-capability partners like Japan and Australia, but this is still a long-term goal. US analysts know the promise of these high-capability partners, but the power differentials that enable coercion are still very present even for them. China's military dwarfs every other actor in the region, even the high-capability ones like Japan and Australia combined. But parity is not the goal, and credible defense is. And credible defense is attainable, while parity perhaps is not. There will be real hurdles towards attaining that credible defense, however. Many fear that Japan's economy faces significant demographic headwinds, and its politics may not be ready for its growing international stature. Australia provokes concerns in some US quarters that it has economic vulnerabilities in the Asia-Pacific that could eventually complicate its strategic calculations. But these are surmountable challenges. The international system, as we know it, though showing its age, has done a great deal of good in the 20th and 21st centuries. We owe it to that system to make sure it is nimble and adaptable enough for the more complex natures of power, competition, and coercion, and their security, economic, and demographic forms now appearing in our modern international community. But let's not overthink this problem. The ancient Melians, who famously suffered what they had to at the hands of the much more powerful Athenians, would not recognize a modern diesel-powered destroyer today, but they would recognize maritime coercion when they saw it. Thank you.